The howl of the westbound wind was the only constant companion Caleb Fletcher had known in his 28 years of wandering. Standing at 6'2" with shoulders made broad from breaking horses and hands calloused from years on the trail, he gazed upon the weathered sign that read Palisade, Colorado, population 312, with wary eyes the color of a storm-filled sky. It was 1878, and the country was healing from wounds still fresh from the war. Caleb had no allegiance to North or South. His only loyalty was to the open sky above and the spirited Mustang beneath him. He drifted through Wyoming, Nebraska, and now Colorado, taking odd jobs, breaking wild horses, and moving on before anyone could know him well enough to ask why he never stayed. "What do you think, Thunder?" He murmured to the midnight black stallion that had been his sole companion for the past 4 years. The horse snorted, pawing at the dirt road leading into the small mining and railroad town nestled against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. Palisade wasn't much to look at: a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon whose piano music drifted on the air, a general store, and scattered houses with smoke rising from chimneys against the autumn chill. But winter was coming, and even a drifter like Caleb knew better than to face a Colorado mountain winter without shelter. "Just until spring," he promised Thunder as much as himself. "Then we'll head to California like we planned." The livery stable was his first stop. The owner, a grizzled man named Hank with a limp and tobacco-stained whiskers, sized him up with knowing eyes. "Looking for work or just bored for your horse?" Hank asked, running a practiced hand down Thunder's flank. "Both if you're offering," Caleb replied. "I can break horses better than most." Hank nodded thoughtfully. "Got a few wild ones came in last week. Miners bought 'em cheap thinking they could tame them, found out different." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the hay. "Room above the stable's empty, nothing fancy, but it's got a stove and a bed. Yours for the winter if you can handle the tough ones nobody else wants." Caleb accepted with a single nod. The room was sparse: a narrow iron bed with a lumpy mattress, a small table with a lone chair, and a pot-bellied stove that hadn't been lit in months, coated with dust and cobwebs. But it had 4 walls and a roof, which was more than he'd had many nights. He unpacked his meager belongings: 2 shirts, an extra pair of denims, his father's old pocket watch that hadn't ticked in years, a worn Bible he kept but rarely opened, and his tools of the trade: rope, spurs, and the simple tin coffee pot that had seen him through countless mornings on the trail. The stove remained cold. Caleb had never bothered learning to cook much beyond coffee and beans over an open campfire. In towns, he ate at saloons or boarding houses. A proper stove seemed like an unnecessary complication for a man who never stayed anywhere long enough to need one. That first week in Palisade passed in a blur of dust and hoofbeats as Caleb proved his worth with the wild horses. His reputation grew quickly in the small town. Folks began to nod in recognition when he walked past, and the barkeep at the Silver Dollar Saloon learned to have a whiskey ready when he came through the swinging doors each evening. It was there, 10 days after his arrival, that Caleb first heard about the widow's place on the edge of town. "Shame about that Harper woman," the barkeep said to no one in particular as he wiped down the counter. "Another winter alone up there, and that good piece of land just going to waste." "Who's Harper?" Caleb found himself asking, surprising himself at his own curiosity. "Bethany Harper," replied a miner sitting 2 stools down. "Came out here with her husband David about 3 years back. He had big plans for that land: good water, fertile soil, but fever took him just last spring. She's been trying to hang on, but it's too much for a woman alone." "She's got that little trading post on the property," another man added. "Sells eggs and milk when her cow's producing. Jams in summer, but that won't get her through winter." Caleb nodded, already withdrawing into himself again. It wasn't his business, and he wasn't looking to make it so. He finished his drink in silence and returned to his cold room above the livery. The next morning brought the first snow of the season: light flurries that dusted the town like powdered sugar. Caleb had just finished exercising a particularly stubborn pinto when Hank approached him, looking uncomfortable. "Got a favor to ask," the stable owner said, shifting his weight off his bad leg. Mrs. Harper's coming into town today. Her wagon wheel's been wobbling, and she asked if I could spare someone to take a look. My joints are screaming with this weather coming in. Would you mind? Caleb wanted to refuse. Getting involved with a widow's problems was exactly the kind of entanglement he avoided. But he owed Hank for the room and the work, so he nodded curtly. I'll look at it. He saw her before she saw him. Bethany Harper was not what he expected. He'd imagined someone older, worn down by hardship. Instead, she was young, perhaps 25, with chestnut hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet. She wore a blue dress faded from washing but neat and carefully mended. Her face was turned away as she spoke to the general store owner, but when she laughed at something he said, the sound carried across the street like music. Caleb hung back, suddenly uncertain, watching as she loaded supplies into her wagon. When she finally turned and saw him approaching, her smile faded into wariness. "Mrs. Harper?" he asked, removing his hat. "Hank asked me to look at your wheel." Her eyes, the warm brown of autumn leaves, assessed him quickly. "You're the new horsebreaker," she said. It wasn't a question. "Caleb Fletcher," he nodded, feeling uncharacteristically awkward. "I appreciate you looking, Mr. Fletcher, but I can manage." "I'm sure you can," he replied evenly, "but a broken wheel 10 miles from town in a snowstorm won't do you any favors." Something shifted in her expression, a reluctant acknowledgement that he was right. She stepped aside, allowing him to examine the wheel. The problem was obvious. The iron rim had worked loose and the wood was beginning to split. "This won't make it back to your place," he told her bluntly. "It needs proper repair at the blacksmith's." Worry creased her brow. "That will take days. I can't stay in town that long." Caleb hesitated, then made an offer that surprised even himself. "I can fix it temporarily to get you home, then bring the blacksmith out to your place tomorrow to do it right." Suspicion flashed in her eyes. "Why would you do that?" The question caught him off guard. Most people didn't question offered help. "Because it's going to snow harder tonight and you shouldn't be stranded," he said simply. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, Mr. Fletcher, I accept your help." He worked quickly, using rope and a piece of metal banding to secure the wheel well enough for the journey home. When he finished, she thanked him with formal politeness and climbed onto the wagon seat. "You should wait," he said, looking at the darkening sky. "Storms coming faster than expected." "I know my land and the way home," she replied. "I've weathered Colorado storms before." Something stubborn in her tone reminded him of the wild horses he worked with, proud and determined not to show fear. Before he could respond, she had flicked the reins and set the wagon in motion. Caleb watched her go, telling himself it wasn't his concern. He turned back toward the livery, intending to forget about Bethany Harper and her broken wheel. He made it 3 steps before cursing under his breath and striding toward the stable to saddle Thunder. The snow began falling in earnest as Caleb followed the wagon tracks leading out of town. The temperature dropped rapidly and the wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally. He pulled his coat collar higher and pressed on, Thunder's hooves breaking through the thin crust of white that was rapidly covering the trail. He caught up to her wagon just as visibility became dangerously poor. She was hunched on the seat, struggling to see the path ahead. When Thunder's nicker announced their presence, she startled and turned. "You're following me," she accused, her voice raised against the wind. "I'm making sure you get home," he corrected. "This storm's worse than either of us thought." For a moment he thought she would argue, but a powerful gust rocked the wagon and practicality won out. "It's another 3 miles," she shouted. "Follow close. There's a creek crossing that can be tricky." The journey that should have taken less than an hour stretched to nearly 3 as they navigated the worsening conditions. By the time the shadowy outline of her cabin came into view, both were half frozen and the light was fading fast. The Harper homestead was modest but well built. A sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn, and what appeared to be a root cellar dug into the side of a gentle slope. A sign near the road read Harper's Trading Post, though it was now nearly obscured by snow. Bethany's relief was palpable as she guided her horse and wagon toward the barn. Caleb dismounted to help her, his fingers stiff with cold as they worked together to unhitch her horse and settle both animals inside the shelter. The interior of the barn was neat and well organized, with stacked hay, tools hanging in precise order, and stalls mucked out recently. "You can stay until the storm passes," she said as they secured the barn door against the wind. There was no gratitude in her voice, just practical acceptance of necessity. The cabin interior revealed much about its occupant. It was small but immaculately kept, with handmade curtains at the windows and a colorful quilt on the rocking chair beside the fireplace. Shelves held jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, each labeled in careful handwriting. A door at the back presumably led to a bedroom. Everything spoke of care and attention to detail. But it was cold. The fireplace held only gray ashes, and the iron cookstove in the corner stood dark and lifeless. Bethany moved with efficient purpose, striking a match to the kindling laid ready in the fireplace. "I'll make coffee once this catches," she said, not looking at him. "You can hang your coat by the door." Caleb stood awkwardly just inside the threshold, feeling like an intruder. He wasn't accustomed to being in another person's home, especially not a woman's. His gaze kept returning to the cookstove. "Do you need help with that?" he asked, nodding toward it. "With what?" She glanced up from the fireplace, where flames had begun to lick at the larger pieces of wood. "The stove, for cooking." Something like surprise flashed across her face. "I wasn't planning to cook tonight, just coffee and some bread, because of the storm." He asked, confused by her reaction. She stood, brushing her hands against her skirt. "Mr. Fletcher, I haven't lit that stove in 3 months." The admission hung in the space between them. In that moment, Caleb recognized a familiar weariness in her eyes that had nothing to do with the difficult journey they'd just completed. "Why not?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "It seems pointless to cook properly for just myself," she said with a small shrug that tried to dismiss the loneliness behind the words. "Coffee and bread fill the stomach well enough." Caleb looked at the stove again, then back at this woman who maintained her trading post and kept her barn in perfect order but couldn't bring herself to light her own stove. Something stirred in him, a recognition he wasn't prepared for. "I'll start it," he heard himself say. "If you'll show me how." Surprise widened her eyes. "You don't know how to light a stove?" He felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the growing fire in the hearth. "Never had reason to learn, been on the move most of my life. Campfires are simpler." The admission seemed to shift something between them. She studied him with new interest, as though seeing him properly for the first time. "All right, Mr. Fletcher," she said, a hint of challenge in her voice. "I'll teach you to light a stove if you're willing to learn." "Caleb," he corrected. "If you're teaching me to cook, seems we should use first names." A faint smile touched her lips. "Bethany, then." She moved toward the stove. "Let's see what we can make of this evening, Caleb." As the blizzard raged outside, Bethany taught Caleb the fundamentals of working a cookstove: how to arrange the kindling, how to adjust the dampers to control heat, how to tell when the surface was hot enough for cooking. Her hands moved with the confidence of long practice, though she admitted she hadn't been raised to cook. "I was a school teacher in St. Louis," she explained as she showed him how to test the heat with a sprinkle of water. "I could barely boil water when David and I married." He found it endlessly amusing, his educated wife who could recite Shakespeare but couldn't make biscuits. "You learned," Caleb observed, watching her efficiently prepare a simple meal from her store's cornbread and bean soup with salt pork. "Necessity is an effective teacher." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "David was patient, said I had 3 years to learn what most girls knew by 12. As they worked, the stove radiated warmth that slowly permeated the cabin. The aroma of cooking food filled the space, transforming it from merely shelter to something that tugged at memories Caleb had long suppressed. "My mother had a stove like this," he found himself saying as they sat down to eat. "Smaller. She used to hang herbs above it to dry." Bethany looked up, clearly surprised by the personal disclosure. Where was this? Kansas, small farm near Fort Scott. He hadn't spoken of his childhood in years. "She died when I was 10, fever." "I'm sorry," Bethany said softly. "And your father?" "Tried farming alone for a few years. Wasn't cut out for it. We started moving west when I was 13. Ranch work, mostly. He died in a stampede when I was 17. "So you've been alone since then," she observed, passing him more cornbread. He nodded, uncomfortable with how easily she'd summarized his existence. "What about you?" he asked, eager to shift attention away from himself. "How did you end up in Palisade?" The question dimmed the light in her eyes, but she answered evenly. "David had tuberculosis. The doctor recommended Colorado air. He was a dreamer, saw this place and imagined a prosperous farm, children running through the fields." Her fingers twisted the plain gold band she still wore. "We had 2 good years. The trading post was my idea, a way to make extra money while the farm established itself." "It seems successful," Caleb offered. "It keeps me fed," she acknowledged. "The townsfolk are kind. They make a point to stop here for eggs or preserves even when they don't need them." "And now," he asked carefully, "what are your plans?" She looked around the cabin, her expression unreadable. "Survive the winter. Beyond that," she shrugged. "I have a brother in California who's offered me a place, but this land was David's dream. Leaving feels like giving up on him," Caleb finished for her. Their eyes met in a moment of unexpected understanding. "Yes," she whispered. "Exactly like that." The howling wind filled the silence between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, something had changed. The stove crackled with life, food warmed their bodies, and 2 solitary people found themselves sharing not just shelter from the storm, but fragments of the stories that had shaped them. When the meal was finished, Bethany insisted Caleb take the bedroom while she slept on a pallet by the fire. He protested, but she was firm. "I've slept by this hearth many nights," she told him, "and you're too tall for my quilt pallet." He couldn't argue with the practical truth of that, so he reluctantly accepted, though it felt strange to occupy her private space. The bedroom was small and simply furnished. A bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a Bible and a framed daguerreotype that must have been her husband. Caleb averted his eyes from it, feeling like an intruder. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams filled with images of his mother's kitchen and the smell of bread baking in a stove he'd forgotten until now. Morning brought stillness. The storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white stretching to the horizon. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the main room. Bethany had already been out to tend the animals. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold as she poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Road should be passable by midday," she said by way of greeting. "Though your wheel repair held better than I expected." Caleb accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Still needs proper fixing. I'll bring the blacksmith out like I promised." She seemed about to protest, then reconsidered. "I would appreciate that, thank you." They shared a simple breakfast of leftover cornbread. The stove, Caleb noticed, remained lit, its steady heat a presence in the room that seemed to fill more than just the physical space. "I should check on Thunder," he said when they had finished eating. Outside, the world was blindingly white and crisp with cold. Thunder greeted him with an impatient nicker, clearly ready to be moving again. Caleb took his time brushing the stallion down, using the familiar routine to organize his thoughts. This homestead, with its careful order and the determined woman who maintained it alone, stirred something unexpected in him. He'd spent so many years drifting that he'd forgotten what it was to feel connected. One night sheltering from a storm shouldn't have affected him this way. When he returned to the cabin, Bethany was packing a small bundle of food. "For your journey back," she explained, not meeting his eyes. "It's a cold ride." He accepted the package, aware of an odd reluctance to leave. "I'll return with the blacksmith tomorrow," he reminded her. "Weather permitting," she nodded, finally looking up at him. "Safe travels, Caleb." The ride back to Palisade gave him too much time to think. The vast white expanse seemed to echo the emptiness of his own existence, drifting from place to place, connecting with no one, leaving nothing behind that would mark his passing through the world. He'd always told himself it was freedom. Now, for the first time, he wondered if it was merely running. True to his word, Caleb returned the next day with the blacksmith, a burly man named Schmidt who complained good-naturedly about being dragged out to the middle of nowhere but did exemplary work on Bethany's wagon wheel. While Schmidt worked, Caleb found himself helping Bethany with her chores, splitting wood, checking her roof for damage from the storm and repairing a broken hinge on the root cellar door. "You don't have to do all this," she said as he stacked the newly split wood beside the cabin. "I know," he replied simply and continued working. That evening, before leaving, he found himself lingering by the stove, which she had kept burning since his departure. "You should come to town sometime," he said awkwardly, "for supplies or whatever you might need." A small smile played at her lips. "Are you concerned about my wheel again, Mr. Fletcher?" "Caleb," he reminded her. "And no, I just thought." He trailed off, unsure what he had thought. Anyway, the offer stands. To his surprise, Bethany did come to town the following week. Caleb was working with a particularly difficult mare when he spotted her wagon approaching the livery. He finished the training session quickly and found himself straightening his shirt before walking over to greet her. "Mrs. Harper," he said, tipping his hat. "What brings you to Palisade?" "Bethany," she corrected with a hint of amusement. "And I've come to purchase supplies. Winter won't last forever, and I need to prepare for spring planting." He nodded, aware of the eyes of townsfolk watching their interaction with interest. Small towns thrived on gossip, and a widowed woman speaking to the mysterious horsebreaker was fodder indeed. "Would you? That is, could I offer to buy you lunch?" he asked, the words awkward on his tongue. "The hotel dining room serves a decent stew." She hesitated, clearly aware of the attention they were attracting. "That's very kind, but please," he said, surprising himself with the earnestness in his voice. "I'd like to hear your plans for the spring crops." Something in his expression must have convinced her, because after a moment she nodded. "All right, thank you." The hotel dining room was quiet at that hour. They sat at a corner table, initially making stilted conversation about the weather and conditions of the roads. But as the meal progressed, the awkwardness between them eased. Bethany spoke of her plans for the farm vegetables. She intended to grow both for her own use and to sell at her trading post. Repairs needed on the irrigation system her husband had begun, a root cellar expansion she hoped to complete before summer. "You've thought it all through," Caleb observed. "I have to," she replied simply. "Surviving here requires planning, and you're determined to stay?" he asked. Despite your brother's offer, she was quiet for a moment, stirring her stew thoughtfully. "I made a promise to David that I would make this land thrive," she finally said. "I intend to keep it, even if it means doing it alone." Her eyes met his. "What about you? How long will you stay in Palisade?" The question caught him off guard. "Until spring, I suppose, then California like I planned. Always moving," she observed. "What are you looking for, Caleb?" No one had asked him that question before, perhaps, because he'd never stayed in one place long enough for anyone to wonder. He found he had no ready answer. "I'm not looking," he said finally. "Just going. There's a difference. There is to me." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the town's mayor, a portly man who greeted Bethany with exaggerated concern. "Mrs. Harper, we've been worried about you out there all alone since the storm. The town council was just discussing whether we should send someone to check on you." Bethany's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "As you can see, Mayor Wilson, I'm perfectly fine. My farm weathered the storm well." "Yes, well, a woman alone." The mayor shook his head. "It's not proper. Perhaps it's time to consider selling that land to someone who can work it properly." "Johnson's been interested, you know." Caleb felt a surge of unexpected anger at the man's condescension. Before he could speak, Bethany responded with cool dignity. "The land isn't for sale, Mayor, and I'm quite capable of working it myself, as I've demonstrated for nearly a year now." The mayor looked taken aback, then noticed Caleb for the first time. His expression shifted to one of calculation. "Fletcher, isn't it? The horsebreaker, are you assisting Mrs. Harper now?" The implication was clear, and Caleb saw Bethany's cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. "I repaired her wagon wheel after the storm," Caleb replied evenly. "And I'm having lunch with a friend. Nothing more to it than that." Mayor Wilson looked unconvinced but retreated with a few more platitudes. When he was gone, Bethany's shoulders slumped slightly. "That's why I avoid town when possible," she said quietly. "Everyone has an opinion about what I should do with my life and my land." "Johnson been making offers?" Caleb asked, remembering the mayor's comment. "Regularly. He owns the adjacent property and wants mine for grazing." She shook her head. He's been persistent since David died, offering less than the land is worth and suggesting I'm foolish to refuse. But you're staying. She looked up at him, determination in her eyes. I'm staying. That lunch marked the beginning of a cautious friendship. Over the following weeks, Caleb found reasons to ride out to the Harper homestead delivering supplies she'd ordered, bringing news from town, checking her roof after another heavy snow. Each time she invited him in for coffee, and each time he noted with quiet satisfaction that the stove remained lit. They fell into an unexpected rhythm. He would help with whatever heavy work needed doing, repairing fences, clearing snow, chopping wood, and she would teach him something in return. How to make biscuits that didn't resemble rocks. How to darn a sock instead of throwing it away. How to predict weather changes from the behavior of animals and the feel of the air. In turn, he showed her how to gentle a nervous horse, how to set snares for rabbits, how to sharpen an axe properly. It was an exchange that benefited them both, but Caleb found himself looking forward to these visits for reasons that had nothing to do with practical skills. Bethany was intelligent and well-read, often reciting poetry or discussing books as they worked. She had a quiet sense of humor that emerged more frequently as she grew comfortable with him. And she possessed a strength that had nothing to do with physical power, the kind of resilience that had allowed her to face loss and continue forward. One evening in late January, as they sat by her fireplace after a long day of repairing storm damage to her barn, Bethany asked the question he'd been dreading. "Why have you never settled anywhere, Caleb?" He stared into his coffee cup, considering deflection but finding he wanted to give her an honest answer. "After my father died, I tried staying in one place, worked a ranch in Wyoming for almost 2 years, started caring about the people there." He set the cup down carefully. "Then there was an outbreak of smallpox. 8 people died, including the family of the ranch owner, his wife, and 2 children. He sold the ranch afterward, couldn't bear to stay. I realized then that roots just give you something to lose. So you decided never to put down roots at all." She asked softly. It seemed simpler. "Simpler isn't always better," she observed, "or fuller." "What about you?" he countered. "You've put down roots and they've brought you pain." "Yes," she acknowledged, "but they've also brought me purpose, memories, a sense of belonging somewhere." She gestured around the cabin. "This is mine, in a way nothing else has ever been. Even with David gone, I have this place we built together." Her words stayed with him long after he'd returned to his Spartan room above the livery. That night, lying on his narrow bed listening to the horses below, Caleb confronted a truth he'd been avoiding. He was no longer certain he wanted to leave Palisade when spring came. February brought milder weather and the first hints of the coming thaw. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for months. Birds returned, their songs filling the morning air with promises of renewal. Caleb's work at the livery continued, but he found himself spending more and more time at Bethany's farm. Together they prepared for planting season, clearing fields, repairing tools, planning what would go where. He never officially agreed to help with the spring planting. It was simply assumed by both of them that he would. The townsfolk noticed. Whispers followed him when he walked down Palisade's main street. Some were merely curious, others disapproving. A single man spending so much time with a widow less than a year after her husband's death raised eyebrows, especially since Caleb made no pretense of courting her properly. Hank, the livery owner, finally broached the subject one evening as they finished the day's work. "People are talking, Fletcher," he said bluntly, "about you and the Harper widow." Caleb continued, brushing down a horse, his face impassive. "People always talk. She's respected in this town." "Good woman who's had a hard time. If your intentions aren't honorable, they're not anything," Caleb interrupted, more sharply than he intended. "We're friends. She needs help with her farm, that's all." Hank regarded him skeptically. "If you say so." "But a woman in her position has to be careful about her reputation. And a drifter like you, I know what I am," Caleb cut him off, "and so does she." But the conversation troubled him. Was he compromising Bethany's standing in the community? The thought that he might be causing her harm, even unintentionally, was unbearable. The next time he visited the farm, he arrived with his concerns weighing heavily on his mind. Bethany was in the vegetable garden she'd started preparing, marking rows with string and stakes. She looked up as he approached, a smile lighting her face that made his heart perform an unexpected flip in his chest. "You're earlier than I expected," she greeted him. "I've just been planning where the beans will go." Caleb dismounted, tying Thunder to the fence post. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Her smile faded at his serious tone. "What's happened? People in town are talking about us spending time together." He kept his voice neutral, factual. "It could damage your reputation." Bethany straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "I see. And this concerns you because you've worked hard to build a life here, to be respected. I don't want to be the reason that's compromised." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "What exactly are you suggesting, Caleb, that you stop coming here?" The thought created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. If that's what's best for whom? There was a challenge in her voice now. "For me, or for you, so you don't have to face whatever it is you're feeling." The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I'm thinking of you," he insisted. "Are you?" She took a step closer. "Or are you looking for a reason to pull away before you get too attached, before you have something to lose?" Her words hit too close to the truth. Caleb felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. "I'm leaving when spring comes," he said, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "That's always been the plan." "Plans can change," she replied quietly, "if there's reason enough to change them." They stood facing each other, the carefully marked garden rows between them like a boundary neither was certain how to cross. In that moment, Caleb realized with startling clarity that he'd already failed at his lifelong strategy of detachment. Somehow, without intending to, he'd begun to care about this place, about this woman, about a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "I don't know how to stay," he admitted finally. "I've never learned." Her expression softened. "Maybe that's something else I could teach you." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the road toward the farm, and Caleb recognized the lead rider as Johnson, the neighboring rancher who'd been trying to buy Bethany's land. Bethany's posture stiffened as she saw who was approaching. "What does he want now?" she murmured, more to herself than to Caleb. Johnson was a heavy-set man in his 40s, prosperous looking in a way that spoke of ambition rather than hard work. The 2 men with him had the weathered look of ranch hands, but something in their manner put Caleb instantly on alert. "Mrs. Harper," Johnson called as they drew closer. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you've reconsidered my offer. Spring's coming, and that's a lot of land for a woman to manage." "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Johnson," Bethany replied coolly. "The land isn't for sale." Johnson's gaze shifted to Caleb, eyes narrowing. "Fletcher isn't it, the horse breaker?" His tone suggested the occupation was barely a step above vagrant. "Interesting to find you here." "Just helping a friend," Caleb replied evenly, moving to stand beside Bethany, Johnson's mouth twisted in a smirk. "Is that what they're calling it these days? Helping?" He looked back at Bethany. "You should be careful about the company you keep, Mrs. Harper. People talk." "Is that a threat?" Caleb asked quietly. "Just an observation." Johnson's casual tone didn't match the coldness in his eyes. "I'm offering fair price for this land, more than fair considering its condition." "Its condition is improving daily," Bethany countered, "and it will be even better once the crops are in." Johnson shook his head. "You're being stubborn for no reason. Your husband's gone. This was his dream, not yours." "You don't know what my dreams are," Bethany said, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." For a moment it seemed Johnson might press the issue, then he shrugged, turning his horse. "Think about it, Mrs. Harper. My offer won't stand forever, and winter's left you in a precarious position. Everyone knows it." After the riders departed, Bethany's composure faltered slightly. Her hands trembled as she picked up her gardening tools. "How often does he come around like that?" Caleb asked, concern edging his voice. "Every few weeks since David died. His offers started reasonably, but they've gotten lower each time." She shook her head. "He knows I'm running out of savings before the first harvest." "Has he threatened you before?" "Not directly," she admitted. "But there have been incidents. A fence cut that let my cow wander, tools missing from the barn, anger flashed through Caleb, hot and unexpected. Why didn't you tell me? Because they're not your problems to solve, she replied simply. And because I was afraid. Afraid of what? She looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her eyes. That if things got difficult here, you'd decide it was time to move on. That's what you do, isn't it? When situations get complicated, her perception cut to the heart of the pattern he'd established throughout his adult life. Whenever attachments formed or complications arose, he simply moved on to the next town, the next job, the next temporary existence. I wouldn't leave you to face someone like Johnson alone, he said firmly, but you're planning to leave me alone anyway, she pointed out. Just not until spring. The contradiction in his position struck him forcefully. He was willing to defend her against Johnson, but not to commit to staying beyond some arbitrary date he'd set for himself. Bethany, it's all right, she interrupted, her voice gentle despite the hurt he could see in her eyes. I've known from the beginning you were passing through, She paused, struggling visibly with her words. I just wish you could see that there might be reasons to stop running. Before he could respond, she turned back to her garden work, effectively ending the conversation. Caleb joined her, and they worked side by side for the remainder of the afternoon, the unspoken feelings between them creating both a barrier and a bond that neither seemed ready to address directly. That evening, as had become their custom, Bethany cooked a simple meal on the stove that remained perpetually lit now. They ate mostly in silence, the earlier conversation and Johnson's visit hanging between them. As Caleb prepared to leave, Bethany handed him a small package wrapped in cloth. Biscuits, she explained at his questioning look. From the batch we made yesterday, they're not bad for a man who couldn't light a stove 3 months ago. The simple gesture, her remembering his clumsy early attempts at cooking, her acknowledgement of how far he'd come, affected him more deeply than he could express. Thank you, he said, the words inadequate for everything he wanted to convey. She nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly before she looked away. Be careful riding back. The moon's not full tonight. As Caleb made his way back to Palisade through the gathering darkness, his thoughts were in turmoil. The confrontation with Johnson had crystallized something he'd been avoiding acknowledging. He cared what happened to Bethany and her farm. He wanted to see her succeed, to witness the land bloom under her care, to be part of whatever she was building here. But wanting wasn't the same as staying. Staying meant vulnerability, commitment, the possibility of loss. It meant becoming the kind of man who could promise tomorrow and all the days after, when he'd spent his adult life avoiding promises of any kind. The following week brought the first real signs of spring. Snow melted in earnest, turning the roads to mud and revealing the winter-browned grass beneath. Birds built nests, and the first tiny shoots appeared in Bethany's carefully prepared garden beds. Caleb continued his work at the livery, but his thoughts were constantly with the farm and the woman who ran it. He found reasons to ride out there almost daily now, bringing seeds from the general store, helping prepare more land for planting, repairing the chicken coop that had suffered damage during the winter. Each visit deepened the connection between them, though neither spoke directly of feelings or futures. There was a new awareness in their interactions, a lingering glance, a touch that lasted longer than necessary, conversations that edged toward deeper matters before retreating to safer ground. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of pink and gold, Bethany broke the careful pattern they'd established. When exactly were you planning to leave for California? She asked, her voice deliberately casual. Caleb's hands stilled on the piece of wood he'd been whittling. I hadn't set a specific date, but soon. It wasn't a question, he nodded, not trusting himself to speak. I see. She was quiet for a long moment, then added softly, I'll miss our cooking lessons. The simple admission cracked something in his chest. Bethany, you don't have to say anything, she interrupted. I understand, I've always understood. She stood brushing invisible dust from her skirt. I should check on the stove, the bread might be ready. Before she could step away, Caleb caught her hand. The touch was light, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. I don't want to go, he admitted, the words feeling like they were torn from some deep place inside him, but I don't know if I can stay. Her fingers tightened around his. Why not? Because I'm afraid, he said simply, finally voicing the truth that had driven his wandering for so many years. Afraid of caring too much, of losing what I care about. Bethany sat back down beside him, her hand still in his. Do you think I'm not afraid too? She asked quietly. I lost my husband less than a year ago. I wake up every day knowing I might lose this farm, that Johnson might find a way to take it, that a bad harvest could ruin everything I've worked for. She took a deep breath. Being afraid isn't reason enough not to try, Caleb. He looked down at their joined hands. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to build something permanent. You helped build this, she said, gesturing toward the newly repaired chicken coop, the freshly planted fields, the stacked firewood that would season through summer for next winter's use. You've already been part of making something lasting. The realization struck him with unexpected force. Without intending to, he had indeed helped create something that would endure beyond his present's improvements to her land, that would benefit her long after he was gone, if he went. The thought slipped into his consciousness, no longer theoretical but a genuine choice before him. He could leave, as he'd always done, or he could stay and see what might grow from the seeds they'd planted together both in the earth and between them. Before he could respond, a gunshot shattered the evening quiet. Both of them jumped to their feet as a second shot rang out, closer this time. That came from the north pasture, Bethany said, alarm clear in her voice. Get inside, Caleb ordered, already moving toward the barn where he'd left his rifle. No, she countered firmly. This is my land, I'm coming with you. There was no time to argue. Caleb grabbed his rifle and Bethany took a shotgun from above the cabin door. Together they moved toward the sound, staying low and using the gathering dusk as cover. They found the source of the disturbance at the north fence line. 3 of Johnson's men were shooting at Bethany's cow, which lay dead in the field, while another was cutting through the fence wire. Hey, Caleb shouted, raising his rifle. Step away from that fence. The men turned, startled by the confrontation. One raised his gun, but Caleb's warning shot over their heads made him reconsider. We're on Harper land, Caleb called. You're trespassing. This section's disputed, one of the men called back. Johnson says the boundary marker was moved. That's a lie, Bethany said, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. The boundary hasn't changed since the original survey. The standoff held for a tense moment before one of Johnson's men, clearly the leader, signaled the others to back away. Johnson will hear about this, he warned. Tell him I'll be filing a complaint with the sheriff tomorrow, Bethany replied. About the trespassing and the cow. The men retreated, but their parting glares promised this wasn't the end of the matter. After they were gone, Bethany approached her dead cow, grief evident in her slumped shoulders. She was my only milk cow, she said quietly. I can't afford to replace her before harvest. Caleb surveyed the cut fence, anger building in him. This wasn't random. Johnson's escalating, trying to force you out. She nodded, her practical nature already asserting itself despite the loss. We need to repair this fence tonight. If any of my remaining animals wander onto his property, he'll claim them. They worked by lantern light, mending the fence as best they could until it was too dark to continue. By the time they returned to the cabin, both were exhausted and mud splattered. Bethany moved to the stove automatically, putting on water for coffee, the routine providing some normalcy in the face of the evening's events. But when she turned back to Caleb, her composure finally broke. What am I going to do? She asked, her voice cracking. Without that cow, I lose both milk for myself and a steady income from the trading post. Caleb crossed to her without hesitation, drawing her into his arms. She stiffened momentarily, then relaxed against him, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability. We'll figure it out, he promised, the words coming naturally. I have some savings, enough to buy another cow. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. I can't accept that. You can if it's a loan, he countered. Paid back after harvest. She searched his face. A loan implies you'll be here to collect it. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Caleb knew his next words would commit him to a path either forward with her or away on his own. I will be, he said finally. I'm staying, Bethany. Something like hope flickered in her eyes, but she was too cautious to accept it immediately. Because of Johnson, because you feel obligated to protect me. No. He shook his head, then amended, not only that, I'm staying because. He struggled to find words for feelings he'd spent years avoiding. Because when I'm here with you, it feels like something I've been searching for without knowing it. It feels right. And California, she asked softly, your plans. We're just somewhere to go because I didn't have anywhere to be. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture tender and new. I want to be here if you'll have me. As what, Caleb? Her question was direct, challenging him to define what had been growing between them. As whatever you'll allow, he answered honestly. Your friend, your partner in this farm, and maybe if you're willing as more than that when you're ready. Tears welled in her eyes, but she was smiling. I'd like that, she whispered, all of it. The next morning, they rode into Palisade together to file a complaint with the sheriff about Johnson's men. Sheriff Mills was sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. Without witnesses beyond yourselves, it's your word against theirs, he explained, leaning back in his chair. And Johnson has a lot of influence in this county. So he can kill my livestock and damage my property with impunity, Bethany asked, indignation clear in her voice. I didn't say that, the sheriff sighed. I'll talk to him, warn him to stay off your land. But unless we catch them in the act or find more evidence, my hands are tied legally. As they left the sheriff's office, Caleb could see Bethany's frustration in the set of her shoulders and the tight line of her mouth. It's not right, she said as they walked toward the general store. But it's not unexpected either. David always said Johnson had half the county officials in his pocket. Then we'll have to protect your land ourselves, Caleb replied, his mind already forming plans, starting with replacing that cow. At the general store, they found Hank engaged in conversation with several townspeople. When he saw Caleb, he waved him over. Fletcher, just the man I was looking for, got word of a herd coming through next week, including some prime milk cows. Thought you might want first look, given your way with horses. Caleb glanced at Bethany, whose expression had brightened at the news. Actually, we are in the market for a good milk cow. Johnson's men shot Mrs. Harper's last night. This announcement created an immediate stir among the gathered townspeople. Questions came from all directions, and Bethany found herself relating the events of the previous evening to an increasingly outraged audience. That's crossing a line, declared Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife. Stealing or killing livestock is serious business. Sheriff says there's not enough evidence, Caleb explained. Evidence be damned, said old Mr. Thornton, who ran the hardware store. We all know Johnson's been trying to run Mrs. Harper off that land since her husband passed. It ain't right, agreed another man. A widow trying to make her way honest. Bethany straightened, her chin lifting slightly. I appreciate the concern, but I'm not looking for charity. I'm going to keep working my land and running my trading post. With some help, Caleb added, his hand moving instinctively to the small of her back. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by the onlookers. About time, Mrs. Peterson muttered to her companion, not quite quietly enough. By the time they left the general store, news of Johnson's actions and Caleb's evident commitment to helping Bethany had spread through most of the town. The reactions were mixed but predominantly supportive, with many expressing outrage at the neighboring ranchers' tactics. I think you just announced your intentions to the entire town, Bethany observed as they loaded supplies into her wagon. Caleb paused, suddenly aware of the implications of his public stance beside her. I guess I did. Does that bother you? A small smile played at her lips. No. But it does make everything more official. Good, he said firmly. I want it to be. That afternoon, they visited the bank to inquire about a loan for a new cow. The banker, Mr. Lewis, was polite but hesitant until Caleb offered his savings as collateral. You're putting your money up for Mrs. Harper's farm? Lewis asked, clearly surprised. I'm investing in our future, Caleb corrected, the words still new but feeling increasingly right as he spoke them. I'll be working that land with Mrs. Harper going forward. The banker's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. I see. Well, that does change matters somewhat. He shuffled some papers. I believe we can arrange something suitable. As they left the bank, loan secured, Bethany turned to Caleb. You didn't have to do that. Use your savings as collateral. Yes, I did, he replied simply. It's not just your farm anymore, it's ours. If you want it to be, he added, suddenly uncertain. Her answer came in the form of her hand slipping into his, warm and certain. I do. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Spring planting consumed their days tilling soil, sowing seeds, establishing irrigation channels. They purchased a new milk cow, a gentle Jersey that Bethany named Hope, along with 2 calves that would eventually add to their small herd. Caleb moved his few belongings from the room above the livery to the small cabin, though he insisted on sleeping on a pallet in the main room rather than assuming any improper arrangement. The town gossips had enough to discuss without adding that particular scandal. Johnson remained a threat, but a less immediate one since the confrontation had become public knowledge. Several of Bethany's neighbors, small farmers who had their own reasons to dislike the wealthy rancher, began keeping watch, reporting any suspicious activity near her boundaries. As April turned to May, the first crops began to emerge, rows of corn and beans reaching toward the sun, potato plants spreading their leaves, a small patch of wheat waving in the spring breeze. The garden near the house flourished with vegetables and herbs, and Bethany's trading post reopened with fresh milk, eggs, and early greens for sale. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day's work, Bethany broached a subject they'd been circling for weeks. Reverend Thomas asked about you yesterday when he stopped for eggs, she said casually. Wondered if you might be joining the congregation permanently. Caleb set down the harness he'd been repairing. What did you tell him? That he should ask you himself? She glanced at him sideways. He also mentioned, very subtly of course, that he performs weddings on the first Sunday of each month. The implication hung in the air between them. They'd been working side by side for months now, building something together that went beyond mere partnership. But neither had put a name to what was growing between them or spoken of permanent arrangements. Is that something you'd consider? Caleb asked carefully. Marriage to someone like me? She turned to face him fully. What do you mean, someone like you, a drifter? A man without family or background or stop, she interrupted gently. That's who you were, not who you are now. Her hand covered his. The man who helped me light my stove in the middle of a blizzard, the man who taught me how to gentle a frightened horse. The man who chose to stay when staying was the harder path. Her eyes held his. That's who you are to me. Caleb felt something shift inside him, the last resistance to allowing himself this happiness finally crumbling away. I love you, he said, the words emerging with surprising ease for how long he'd held them back. I think I have since that first night when you showed me how to light the stove and then cooked a meal that made this place feel like. He struggled for the right word. Home, she finished for him. It felt like home. Yes. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. I didn't know what that meant until then. And now, her voice was soft, hopeful, now I know it's not a place. His hand moved to cup her cheek. It's where you are. Her smile was like sunrise breaking across the plains. Is that a proposal, Caleb Fletcher? Not a very good one, he admitted with a small laugh. I should do this properly. He slid from the chair to one knee before her, taking her hands in his. Bethany Harper, I love you. I want to build a life with you on this land to see what we can grow together. Will you marry me? Yes, she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. Yes, I will. Their wedding took place on the first Sunday in June in the small white church in Palisade. The entire town turned out, their initial skepticism about the horsebreaker, and the widow having transformed into wholehearted support as they'd watched the couple's dedication to each other. And to the land they were bringing back to life. Bethany wore a simple dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Caleb, almost unrecognizable in a new suit purchased for the occasion, waited at the altar with an expression of wonder that never left his face as she walked toward him. Their vows were straightforward but heartfelt, promises to cherish and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation seemed to shake the rafters of the little church. The celebration afterward was held at their farm, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and everyone contributing food and drink. Even Sheriff Mills attended, pulling Caleb aside at one point to mention quietly that Johnson had been warned officially to stay away from the Fletcher property, a new name that still sounded strange but wonderful to Caleb's ears. As twilight descended, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone on their land. They walked hand in hand through the fields where crops now stood knee-high, promising a bountiful first harvest. "Hard to believe how different this place looks from when I first saw it in winter," Caleb remarked, surveying the transformed landscape. "Hard to believe how different we are," Bethany replied, squeezing his hand. "Both of us." When they reached the cabin, Caleb paused at the threshold. Without a word, he lifted Bethany into his arms, carrying her across as she laughed in delight. Inside, the stove burned steadily, as it had every day since that first night in the blizzard. "Welcome home, Mrs. Fletcher," he said softly, setting her down gently. Her arms encircled his neck, drawing him closer. "Welcome home, Mr. Fletcher," she whispered against his lips. At last, the years that followed brought challenges, as all years do, but also joy in abundance. Their first harvest exceeded expectations, providing enough to sustain them through winter and sell the surplus. Johnson eventually sold his ranch and moved east, ending the threat he had posed to their boundaries. Children came first, a son they named David, after Bethany's first husband, a gesture of respect for the man whose dream had started everything. 2 years later, a daughter they called Mary, after Caleb's mother. Eventually, a second son completed their family, a sturdy boy with his father's quiet nature and his mother's determined spirit. The trading post expanded into a proper store serving the growing community. Their farm became known for its quality produce and dairy, with Caleb's skill with horses adding a breeding program that brought buyers from as far as Denver. Through it all, the stove in their cabin, eventually replaced by a larger one when they expanded the house to accommodate their growing family, remained the heart of their home. Around it, they cooked meals, taught their children, weathered storms both literal and figurative, and built the life neither had dared imagine when they first met. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their now substantial farmhouse watching their children play in the yard, Bethany asked Caleb a question. "Do you ever miss it? The traveling, the freedom of the open road?" He considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked something important. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he admitted. "Answering to no one, carrying everything I owned on one horse." He looked out at their thriving farm, the fields golden with wheat, the orchard they'd planted beginning to bear fruit, the barn where horses with their own breeding mark grazed in the pasture. Then he looked at his wife, her face still beautiful to him, with laugh lines now at the corners of her eyes and a few strands of silver in her chestnut hair. "But I never missed the emptiness," he continued, "the feeling that nothing I did would last beyond my passing through." His hand found hers, the gesture as natural as breathing after a decade together. "What we've built here, this farm, our family, our place in this community, it matters. It will outlast us." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "When did you know for certain that staying was right?" He smiled, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday rather than 10 years ago. "The moment you lit that stove during the blizzard and made something as simple as bean soup smell like everything I'd been looking for without knowing it." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "That's when I started to understand what home could mean." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, their children ran laughing toward the house, called by the familiar dinner bell. Inside, the stove waited to warm them, to cook their food, to gather them together as it had done every day since that first winter night when a drifter had learned what it meant to belong somewhere, and a widow had found the courage to begin again. In the decades that followed, Palisade would grow into a prosperous town, and the Fletcher farm would become one of its cornerstones. Caleb and Bethany would see their children grow up, marry, and begin their own families, some staying to work the expanding farm, others venturing out to build lives elsewhere. They would face drought years and abundant harvests, times of prosperity and moments of hardship. Through it all, they remained each other's constant, the woman who had taught a wanderer how to stay, and the man who had helped a widow find joy again. Their love story became part of the town's folklore, told and retold by those who remembered the horse breaker and the woman whose lit stove had finally given him a place to call home. And on cold winter nights, when wind howled across the Colorado plains just as it had on the evening they first met, they would sit beside their fire, hands intertwined, and marvel at how a chance encounter in a snowstorm had changed the course of two lives forever.